Welcome to Laravel Academy. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to install Laravel 5.2 on a default install of Ubuntu 14.04. Let's get started. We will start off in our terminal, and we will log in using the username and password that we provided during setup. Our first installation will be of Composer. With your browser, navigate to getcomposer.org and head on over to the download button. On this page, you'll see we have a set of instructions to install Composer, as well as a very long set of instructions here, which will verify that the Composer setup file is valid or invalid. With the default install from Ubuntu, PHP is already installed and ready to go, so we can load up our terminal and start inputting these commands directly into our terminal. Let's start with the first command. We are asking PHP to read a file from getcomposer.org/installer and then output the contents to composer setup.php. Now that command has finished, we can do an ll in our current directory for anything which is composer setup. And we can see that it has been downloaded and placed into our directory. Now this extremely long line of code here, as mentioned before, is just to verify the installer. So you can see here it's either going to say the installer is verified or the installer was corrupt, and it will unlink the file or delete it. I'm not going to do this on my system, but you can do it on yours. So let's skip ahead to this composer setup.php. Running the composer setup.php, you will see that it is downloading a composer.far file. This is the composer file itself that we will use. Let's run the next step, which unlinks or removes the composer setup.php. Now, with our composer setup complete, let's go ahead and let's try to run this new file that was downloaded. So we'll say composer.far. You should actually see an error happen. So what we need to do to run this file is we actually have to tell it to run it from the current directory. So we'll have /composer.far. And you can see here is composer itself. So what we can do is we can keep this in our local directory, or we can install it globally. Usually you'll want to install this globally so that you can access Composer anywhere you would like. For instance, if we switch over to our var www html directory and we try to run Composer here, either using composer.far or the /composer, you should see an error, and this is because it is not installed globally. So let's go ahead and fix this. So let's switch back to the directory that we downloaded our Composer in. In my case, it is my home directory. And what I need to do is I need to elevate my privileges using sudo, which will allow me to move composer.far into user/bin, and instead of keeping it as composer.far, I'll just name it composer. So when I run this command, it'll ask me for my password, and if my user is allowed to elevate its privileges, access will be granted. Once again, we can verify that the move was completed successfully by heading over to the user bin directory and either running ll and finding it in the list, or ls, and in this case let's do an ll/more because there's so many items in this directory that we need to space through it, or we need to look through it one at a time. So once you head down to the C, you should see Composer, and if you look at it, it's owned by Laravel Academy, and the permissions are read, write, execute, which are 100% correct. So what this means is we can head back over into any directory that we own with Laravel Academy as my user. So in our case, var www html, and we can run Composer from there. Now, because this is a default install of Ubuntu, one thing that we need to do is change the ownership on the HTML folder itself. Because I'm the only user running on this server, this change isn't going to affect me much. However, if you have multiple users, you may want to rethink this particular change. In my case, I'm just going to change the ownership from root on HTML to my user. What you may want to do is either set up home directories if you have multiple users, or set up a directory each inside HTML and assign the correct user to it. So I'm going to change ownership to Laravel Academy for the HTML folder. So if I do an LL, you can see that Laravel Academy is now the owner of this folder. This allows me to write into this folder, such as using Composer Create Project, without elevating my privileges. So testing Composer will say Create Project, Laravel/Laravel, and let's just give it the folder Laravel install. Composer will go ahead and download the configuration for the Laravel framework, and it will start downloading all of the dependencies that are required for this framework. Just give it a minute or two to complete, and when it completes, it will assign a application key for you automatically, and it will also tell you any errors that you have during installation. If you see these errors, you normally have to install the missing modules using apt-get. In my case, everything looks correct, so let's go ahead and let's try and load up this particular website. So when I browse to my website, you can see that I have a 500 error. This happened because this is the first time installing Laravel in this folder and the permissions are not set up correctly. So let's go ahead and navigate into our installed folder. You can see that all the permissions are set by default to read-write. So the next command we're going to have to use is chmod to change the permissions, and I'm using -r for recursive and assigning just full permissions 777 to storage and bootstrap/cache. Once the permissions have been set, head on back to our web browser, click reload, and we can see the Laravel 5 text in front of us, which means that Laravel 5 is correctly installed and running. Thanks.